It's hard to believe that sometimes your entire life can change in an instant, and how something that seems so small can cause a ripple that affects the rest of your days. The story I'm bringing you today is by no means small. This couple encountered something they couldn't explain. Not only did they witness it, but it followed them on their drive home, eventually taking them to somewhere they couldn't explain and doing absolutely horrific things to them. After which, the couple would have trouble remembering what exactly happened. Thinking it through and taking part in an alternative form of therapy, they would start to remember things that were emotionally scarring, horrifying, and forced to live that torturous night over and over again. This is Chapter 19 of the Insidious Agenda podcast. I'm your host, Nick, and I bring you the story of the first reported alien abductions in human history, the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill. Hey there. Thanks for coming back and listening to another chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast. I'm glad you chose to spend this time with me, and I've got an amazing story for you this week. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our amazing episodes. And to my listeners on YouTube, hit that thumbs up button and let us know you liked the episode. Now the story of Betty and Barney Hill is coming up. Let's get into it. On the evening of September 19th, in 1961, a couple named Betty and Barney Hill were driving back to their home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire after a beautiful vacation. During their trip, they witnessed the beauty and majesty of the Niagara Escarpment, being in awe of its beauty before moving on to their next destination, the storied and cultural city of Montreal, Quebec, in Canada. At about 10:30 p.m., just to the south of the city of Lancaster, Betty noticed a strange glowing object in the sky. She would later note that the object appeared as though it had moved from below the moon's position in the sky, also co-located that evening near the planet Jupiter. She would watch the object move upward and to the west of the moon. Betty didn't want to trouble her husband Barney, who was focusing on their drive down Route 3, so she kept what she saw to herself. Betty had thought that she had seen some sort of shooting star or other celestial object. The only difference here was that it moved in an erratic pattern and seemingly began to grow bigger and brighter. Something felt off, so she finally turned to Barney, urging him to stop the car so she could see it more closely and more clearly. The stop was an easy sell, as it would also offer the opportunity to walk their dog Delcy. Barney, agreeing that it was a good idea, pulled the vehicle over in an idyllic picnic area. Betty grabbed the pair of binoculars they had in the car and looked up at the light. Through them, she saw an odd-shaped craft. A craft that was emitting multicolored, flashing lights and traveling horizontally across the face of the moon. Betty knew this was no celestial object and began to reason that this might actually be a flying saucer. Betty's sister had claimed to witness one only a few years earlier, so a flying saucer certainly wasn't outside the realm of possibility. She handed the binoculars to Barney so he could see what she was watching. Barney opted for a more rational explanation. He believed that it was a commercial plane that was traveling off toward Vermont. His alternative explanation was that it may have been a satellite that possibly drifted off course. In an instant, the object dropped from its position and began to move toward them at incredible speed. Barney would come to the realization that he described as the object that was a plane was not a plane. The couple and their dog Delcy got back into the car quickly and began driving off toward Franconia Notch, a small roadway through the Twin Mountain. As they put the picnic area in their rear-view mirror, they began navigating the roadway. The Franconia Notch is very isolated, and that evening, there were no other vehicles within any distance of them. Because they were forced to drive very slowly, they were able to observe the object as it continued its pursuit. They noticed that the aircraft passed over buildings and even a signal tower that was on top of the adjacent Cannon Mountain. The object would appear again near a figure known as the Old Man of the Mountain, a face-looking rock formation. They estimated that the craft was about 40 feet in length and appeared to rotate on its axis. As they continued driving, the craft began moving erratically across the sky, bouncing back and forth. Betty and Barney made their way toward Indian Head, another mountain in the area, when the aircraft got ahead of them. Barney was forced to stop the vehicle in the middle of the highway as the aircraft began to descend at an impossible speed toward their car. The vehicle was illuminated by the colored lights and made no sound. It hovered above the car, a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, at a height of about 80 to 100 feet. My God, what is this thing? Barney wondered. This can't be real. The light was so bright and the aircraft so large that it took up the entirety of the windshield. The couple were terrified at the events that were unfolding. Barney got out of the vehicle, drew his pistol from his pocket, and began moving toward the aircraft. Still at a distance, Barney got a closer look through the binoculars and was astonished by what he was seeing. 8 to 11 humanoid figures were watching them through the windows of the aircraft. The figures began to move, all except one. While the one remained watching Barney, the others, in unison, moved toward the back of the inner area of the craft. Barney began to feel strange. Something happened next that he didn't understand. He felt as though the one were communicating with him. He received a message saying,
"Stay where you are and keep looking."
He felt as though he were immobilized. He did what he was told. He remained watching these humanoid figures who were wearing glossy black uniforms and black hats. The aircraft began to shift. Red lights began to shine from the aircraft. 2 wings came out of the craft and a long ramp-like structure descended from the bottom. The craft began to move again. It hovered to within 50 feet above him and only 300 feet to his front. He didn't know what these figures really were, but later he would describe them as not being human. When he finally came to his senses, Barney tore the binoculars away from his face and ran back toward the car. He was frightened to his core. "They're going to capture us," he yelled to Betty, but it was too late. The aircraft was above them. He jumped into the driver's seat and began speeding away, pleading for Betty to keep her eyes on the object. She rolled down her window and looked straight up at it. The next thing the Hills heard were the sounds of beeping and buzzing, almost as though they had a rhythm. The sound seemed to bounce off the car. They began to feel the entire car vibrate, and a tingling sensation began to envelop their bodies. their minds moving into some state of altered consciousness and dulled out. Then, all went quiet. When the Hills finally came to, they figured out where they were. They had traveled approximately 35 miles south and had almost no recollection of the entire distance they traveled. The only memory they had was making an emergency turn, hitting a roadblock, and seeing some sort of fiery orb in the sky. The Hills arrived home in Portsmouth at dawn the next day. They described their homecoming as being rather strange. They felt strange sensations and had some odd impulses they couldn't pin down. For example, Betty would insist that the luggage be kept near the back door rather than in the main part of the house. They even noticed their watches had stopped, which, after trying, they were unsuccessful at ever getting to work again. They began noticing other strange things. The leather strap attached to the binoculars was torn, but Barney couldn't recall ever tearing them, even in the frightened state that he was in. The tops of Barney's dress shoes were also scraped badly. He would feel strangely compelled to examine his genitals in the bathroom, although he found nothing strange. Betty and Barney cleaned themselves up, showering off any sort of contamination that they might have been exposed to. Only then did they sit down together and each drew what they had seen. They tried, as best they could, to put together a sequence of events. They knew they witnessed the UFO and that they eventually made it home. They both confirmed that after hearing the buzzing noise, that their memories were fragmented. They decided it would be best to try and sleep off some of the confusion, as they wouldn't be any good trying to figure anything out in the tired state that they were in. After getting a few hours of rest, Betty was the first to awake. She took the shoes and clothes that she had been wearing and put them into her closet. When she picked up the dress she was wearing, she noticed it was torn in multiple locations. The hem, the zipper, and the lining. She also noticed there was some strange form of pink powder on the dress. Trying to get rid of it, she hung the dress out on the clothesline, and the wind carried the powder away. She made an attempt to throw the dress away, as it was no longer any use in the state it was in, but she opted to keep it hanging in her closet. Fast forward a few decades, and her dress has been tested and examined by 5 different laboratories, having gone through various bouts of chemical and forensic analysis. It wasn't just the couple and their clothing that showed signs of strange things. Their car now bore circular shapes on the trunk that they had noticed that weren't there the day before. They described the circles as being shiny, and when the couple brought a compass near them, the needle would go haywire and seemingly come back to normal when pulled away. The day after they returned home, the 21st of September, Betty placed a call to the Pease Air Force Base to report what they had witnessed. As the UFO phenomena was still relatively new in the world's eye, she withheld some of the information so that she and Barney would not be thought of as crazy people. The following day, the Hills were contacted by Major Paul Henderson, who was looking to interview them a little more. Henderson would draft his findings in a report dated the 26th of September and submitted to the U.S. Air Force's top secret Project Blue Book. A few days after that, Betty walked into her town library and borrowed a book on UFOs. The author of the book was a retired Marine Corps officer named Major Donald Kehoe, who currently was the head of NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. The same day as Henderson submitted his report to Project Blue Book, Betty wrote a letter to Donald Kehoe. She would write down the entire story as she remembered it. She told Kehoe about the humanoid figures that Barney had observed and told him that she and Barney were considering regression therapy, being hypnotized so that they could recall what happened. The letter was received at NICAP and passed to Walter Webb. About 10 days after the encounter, Betty would begin experiencing strange dreams. Dreams that were incredibly, horribly vivid. She would experience these dreams over 5 consecutive nights. These were a bit shocking to her, as she had never experienced dreams that were so detailed before. After the 5 nights, she never had the dreams again. They would be on her mind during the daytime, and when she mentioned them to Barney, he was sympathetic to her, but didn't consider the matter to be a big deal. The issue and the dreams were put to rest, and she never mentioned them to Barney again. Walter Webb and the Hills would meet on the 21st of October for a 6-hour interview. The Hills told Webb everything they could remember from their encounter. Barney believed that his mind was blocking out some of the worst parts of the experience and chalked those things up to things he didn't wish to remember. Webb believed them. They were telling the truth, and the incident probably occurred exactly as reported, except for some minor uncertainties and technicalities that must be tolerated in any such observations, where human judgment is involved. These minor uncertainties that he's referring to are usually time, visibility, size, distance, and height. In November, Betty would begin a dream journal, making note of all the intricate details of the strange dreams that she was having. One dream had her and Barney coming to a roadblock where there was a group of men that surrounded their vehicle. She lost consciousness. Coming to, she was being carried by 2 men through a forest at night. Barney was walking behind her but appeared to be sleepwalking or in some sort of trance. The men were all described as being about 5 feet 4 inches tall. They wore identical blue uniforms and hats. They appeared human, but all had black hair, dark eyes, strange, prominent noses, and bluish lips. To those who are all caught up on our episodes, this to me sounds a lot like some of the descriptions of the men in black. She would be escorted up a ramp with her husband into a disc-shaped craft. The craft bore a strange, metallic appearance. When inside, the couple would always be separated. She would protest to the one she knew as the leader, but was told that the examinations would take much longer if the couple were together. When her exam was set to begin, the leader, along with a new man, would come in to conduct hers. This new man she would refer to as the examiner. He was described as having a calm and pleasant manner. The pair of men spoke to her in English, but it was a bit off. He spoke well, but his mastery of the language was imperfect. The examiner told her that they wanted to conduct a few tests in order to make note of the differences between them and humans. She was sat down on a chair with a bright light shone over her. A lock of her hair was taken and much of her body was examined. The examiner took samples of fingernails and skin. Her nervous system was tested, and then, out of nowhere, a needle was thrust into her stomach through her navel. Betty was in tremendous pain, she would later recall. So then they roll me over, on my back, and the examiner has a long needle in his hand, and I see the needle, and it's bigger than any needle that I've ever seen. When she watched the leader wave his hand, the pain stopped instantaneously. The examiner departed, and Betty was afforded the opportunity to speak with the leader personally. She was given a book filled with strange symbols that she was able to take with her. She would ask where they came from, and the leader pulled down an instructional map that was a star map. She couldn't discern much else from the conversation, and the men would take the Hills from the ship. They would break out into a disagreement, after which the leader took back the book that he gave to Betty. They decided that they didn't even want the Hills to remember the encounter. Betty looked at them and made a promise. She stated that no matter what they did to her or her memory, that she would one day recall everything. The Hills were taken to their car, and the leader suggested they watch the craft depart. Betty and Barney sat there with the illuminated craft going out of sight. This telling was the dream that she experienced every night. Later in November, Betty and Barney were once again visited by two members of NICAP, Robert Homan and Charles Jackson. One of their main lines of questioning was specific to the length of the Hills' trip. The Hills reiterated that their drive home, about 178 miles, should have taken 4 hours. When they pulled into their driveway, the trip had taken 7. This case of missing time is now a common phenomenon known to ufologists. Betty and Barney had no explanation for the loss of time. They confirmed to the reporters that they had no recollection of the 35 miles they drove between Indian Head and Ashland. The couple did remember seeing a fiery orb on the ground, which they thought might have been the moon from their point of view, but the researchers confirmed that explanation wasn't possible, as the moon had set further into the sky that evening than they would have been able to observe. Homan and Jackson suggested regression therapy as a possible means to understand the missing time. Barney was initially apprehensive, but thought it would be in the best interests of his wife, assuaging some of her worries and ultimately putting their minds at ease. Early the next year, in February of 1962, the Hills took various trips to the White Mountains on their weekends off. Their reasoning was that driving the same stretch of road might help pull some of the forgotten memories out that might be hidden or blocked in their minds. They couldn't pinpoint the position they stopped at the night of their encounter, but were able to cross off some of the routes through the mountains. It wouldn't be until many years later, on Labor Day weekend of 1965, they would finally rediscover the site of their capture. In November of 1962, they attended their church's rectory to hear a speech from Captain Ben Sweat of the United States Air Force. When the Hills approached him, Sweat took a great interest in their story. Like the NICAP investigators, his interest was largely centered around their missing time. The following year, on the 3rd of March in 1963, the Hills told their story publicly for the first time to a small group at their church. Captain Sweat returned that September to give a guest lecture on hypnosis. Barney, at this time, was seeing a psychiatrist named Dr. Stevens. Sweat urged him to speak about the possibility of hypnotherapy. Dr. Stevens, on hearing of Barney's interest in the subject, would refer the couple to a man named Benjamin Simon in Boston. In December of that year, the Hills would meet Simon for the first time. Simon, listening to the couple's story, was able to ascertain that the encounter was causing Barney a great deal more trouble than he was letting on. Simon would agree to perform hypnosis, although he outrightly dismissed the extraterrestrial and UFO theory the couple put forward. The first session took place on the 4th of January in 1964. The couple were hypnotized several times each. They also attended sessions separately, so they could not hear one another. So, as not to cause any more undue stress on the couple, Simon reinstated their amnesia before pulling them out of hypnosis. Simon was able to pull a great amount of information out of the couple during their sessions. That information, which we'll get into now. Barney was the first to undergo the hypnosis. He made note of the extraterrestrials, or non-humans as he referred to them. His display showed Simon many emotions: fear, outbursts, rage, and incredulity. It was because of the tremendous amount of fear that Barney kept his eyes shut for much of the encounter. Barney recalled that the binocular strap broke when he was running back to the car. When he took the wheel, he recalled a strange sensation telling him to pull the car off the road and drive into the woods. After doing so, he saw 6 men on a dirt road. The car stalled out, and 3 of these men approached it. Barney was told not to be afraid, but that wouldn't be enough to curb the trauma and anxiety. When speaking with the leader, he was told to close his eyes. Those eyes that had a tremendous, terrifying mesmeric effect. Barney felt as though they were able to get into his brain. I was told to close my eyes because I saw the 2 eyes coming close to mine, and I felt like they pushed into my eyes. All I can see are these eyes. I'm not even afraid that they're not connected to a body. They're just there. They're just up close to me, pressing against my eyes. Next, Barney felt himself taken into the disc-shaped craft and was separated from his wife. He entered a room and was told to lie down on a small rectangular examination table. He couldn't recall many of the specifics of the exam itself as, like before, he kept his eyes closed for most of it. He felt a cup-like device placed over his genitals and was certain that a semen sample was taken. His skin was scraped and his ears and mouth checked out. He felt something enter his anus, but it was quickly removed. Lastly, the vertebrae in his spine were counted. Barney recalled some of the men speaking in a sort of hushed, mumbled language that he had no understanding of. They communicated with him through telepathy, as he didn't ever notice their mouths moving. When the men were done with him, he was taken from the ship to his car. He remembered watching the ship leave. A light appeared on the road that he thought may be the men coming back, but it was more likely that of the moon. This was all the information that could be gathered from Barney's sessions. There wasn't much too different to report during Betty's sessions that she had already outlined during her dreams. Moreover, it was discovered that their accounts were in line with one another. Betty did exhibit a great deal of emotional distress when telling the stories of her capture and examination. There were some sessions that Simon had to end early due to Betty's emotional state being too much for her to handle. On suggestion of Simon, Betty was able to sketch out a star map. In the map were 12 prominent stars that were connected by lines. Also, there were 3 lesser stars which formed a triangle. The lines between the stars were trade routes, where dotted lines were less traveled stars. Following the hypnosis sessions, Barney accepted the fact that he and Betty were the victims of alien abduction. He did feel a sense of relief, however, stating, "I felt so overwhelmed and relieved. Now parts of my life that had been missing were added to it again. Parts of my life were being put back together. I also found that having the experience validated by the doctors involved was important to my recovery." He understood a lot of the facts, however Betty bought into the conclusion as much as he did. The one thing the sessions did help with was to severely diminish the torment surrounding their memories of the abduction. After the sessions, the Hills returned home and life went back to normal. They would discuss their encounter with friends and family members. Other UFO researchers would pay them visits, but overall, Betty and Barney never sought the spotlight. On a front-page article of the Boston Traveler on the 25th of October in 1965, a reporter named John Luttrell had written a piece called UFO Chiller, Did They Seize the Couple? Luttrell had reportedly obtained an audio copy of the lecture the Hills did in the later parts of 1963. He learned that they had undergone hypnosis and was able to somehow obtain confidential information that the Hills had given to UFO investigators. This tinderbox ignited the following day when the story was picked up by the United Press International and the Hills were thrust into the international sphere. In 1966, an author named John Fuller was able to secure the assistance of the Hills and Simon for the writing of his book, The Interrupted Journey. Fuller's book was met with a great amount of success, and even went through several print runs. This would later be expanded upon in the book Captured, The Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. This book was written by Betty's niece, Kathleen Martin, who was also a founding member of the UFO studies organization named MUFON, or the Mutual UFO Network. Martin was able to make use of some of the stories she had heard from Betty herself, and even transcribe the hypnosis sessions into the book, completing a thorough analysis. In 1968, an elementary school teacher named Marjorie Fish from Oak Harbor, Ohio, picked up John Fuller's book. She had a fascination with the book, and could even be considered an amateur astronomer herself. Marjorie was most drawn to the star map and began to question whether or not it could be deciphered. More plainly, she wanted to see if a conclusion could be drawn to what star system Betty was shown by the leader. Her first thought was that one of the major stars must be related to something in our solar system, most likely the Sun. Fish was able to construct a three-dimensional model using household items like beads and thread, and was able to judge distance through the use of other studies and publications. As she had been studying astronomy for years, there was only one system that would match the star map Betty drew. A system 39 light years from Earth, 220 trillion miles away, known as Zeta Reticuli. In awe of this, Marjorie would send her hypothesis to Walter Webb, who would agree with the conclusions she drew. Webb would forward the work to the editor of astronomy magazine, Terence Dickinson. Dickinson, however, did not agree with the answers offered by Fish and Webb. In 1969, on the 25th of February, Betty would say goodbye to her husband Barney, who passed away from a cerebral hemorrhage, or more simply, a brain bleed. After Barney's death, Betty and her story would achieve something akin to celebrity status in the UFO community. Betty passed away from cancer on the 17th of October in 2004 at the age of 85. After the death of her husband Barney, she never remarried. Many alternative theories have also been passed around over the years for what the Hills may have encountered and experienced. Some psychiatrists believe it was entirely a stress-induced hallucination, the stressor being the fact that Betty and Barney were an interracial couple in the 1960s. Betty refuted this throughout her life, stating that her marriage to Barney was a happy one and that they never had any major problem from friends, family, or their community. Their hypnotic psychiatrist, Simon, did not believe that their marriage, or the social circumstances it was a part of, had any bearing on their UFO encounter. A resident local to the abduction area named Jim McDonald put together an incredibly detailed analysis of the Hills' journey that fateful evening. He believed that the couple misperceived a warning beacon for an aircraft on Cannon Mountain as the UFO that followed them. To add credibility to his theory, McDonald also made note that the beacon appears and disappears at the exact locations the Hills noted in their story. The remainder of the circumstances for their situation could be caused by stress, sleep deprivation, and memories that were recovered by hypnosis, leading them to be, as he said, poster children for not driving while sleep deprived. The one thing that's interesting about this, however, is that Betty and Barney told their complete story to the United States Air Force before ever undergoing hypnosis, albeit as best as they remembered it. Another critic of the Hills story was Robert Schaefer, a journalist for the magazine Skeptical Inquirer. In his 1986 book, The UFO Verdict, Examining the Evidence, Schaefer had the following to say about the presentation given by Betty Hill at the 1980 National UFO Conference. I was present for the National UFO Conference in New York City in 1980, at which Betty presented some of the UFO photos she had taken. She showed what must have been far more than 200 slides, mostly of blips, blurs, and blobs against a dark background. These were supposed to be UFOs, coming in close, chasing her car, landing, etc. After her talk, she had exceeded about twice its allotted time. Betty was literally jeered off stage by what had been at first a sympathetic audience. This incident was witnessed by many of ufology's leaders and top activists and removed any lingering doubts about Betty's credibility. She had none. In 1995, Betty Hill wrote a self-published book, A Common Sense Approach to UFOs. It is filled with delusional stories such as seeing entire squadrons of UFOs in flight, and even a truck levitating above the freeway. Schaefer also mentioned in his book that Betty, up until as late as 1977, would attend vigils for UFOs up to 3 times a week. On one occasion, she was joined by a UFO researcher named John Oswald. Oswald would later state that she believed she was seeing UFOs when really there were none. She would believe that even common streetlights were UFO spacecraft. Some believe that the Hills' experiences with their alien abduction could also be drawn from popular media. Television shows like The Outer Limits or the film Invaders from Mars may have played a part in influencing the memories that were recalled by the Hills during their hypnosis. For many similarities between what they recalled and what were shown in the programs can be drawn. We'll never know for certain if what Betty and Barney experienced that evening was truly a UFO abduction or whether there was more rational explanations for what they experienced. Over the years, many more people have come forward with their stories of all different types of abductions, so there is either some great amount of truth to it all or some sort of mass hysteria. I'll leave you here with the words of psychologist Susan Clancy that sum up humanity's belief in not only alien life, but the bigger picture in general. We want to believe that there's something bigger and better than us out there. And we want to believe that whatever it is cares about us, or at least is paying attention to us, that wants us, and that we're special. So that's the story of the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill, the first reported alien abduction in human history. I hope that you liked the story and that you learned something today. And I'd like to thank you very much for coming back and choosing to spend this time listening to the Insidious Agenda podcast. Before you go, remember to give us a thumbs up, leave a rating, but more importantly, remember to subscribe so you can find your way back again next week. Because on next week's episode, we're going to discuss the first reported vampire in human history, Petar Blagojevich, and discuss the lore of vampires as a whole. So this draws this week's story to a close. So come back next Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for a new chapter. But with that, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious Agenda. Thanks again for coming, and I'll see you again next week.